If you've been on my build website recently, you've probably seen a reoccurring theme in terms of proc sets across different specs and classes. Take this Arcanist build for example, with Master Dual Wield, Veteran Ice Staff, Dragon's Appetite and Zaan or Marselok. Some details aside, it's all the same thing on a bunch of other classes as well. It's not specific to my website either, you see it all across information resources like YouTube videos and in general advice given by players. Sets like Master Dual Wield and Rallying Cry, and skills like Vigor and Race Against Time are a common sight in every PvP build. As a build creator myself, I have stopped regular video uploads of builds every patch, because there's nothing new to say. It's not exactly inspiring to work on a 15-minute video telling people to run the same sets on yet another class. You can only run the best sets and skills no matter if you try to go with what was called before a Magicka or Stamina build. Across the classes this is the same case, where you are forced in a similar playstyle and build and little changes across patches. PvP theory crafting is stale now, with most or all of the good builds dissected over and over at length and with no incentive to think outside of the box and try alternative playstyles. This is the result of the major combat changes implemented about a year ago, centering around hybridization and homogenization, and the ongoing efforts to cater to these two concepts. The concept of hybridization is not new. The important changes to promote this idea have been made about a year ago. From that moment onwards, the Stamina and Magicka versions of every class became obsolete, and what was left was a single optimized setup for each class, with a lot of similarities between classes. But only now are we entering into the full consequences of this shift. Only now are we experiencing the Hybridization Endgame. At first, both newer and experienced players had to adjust to the new optimal setups. Letting go of the old familiar archetypes like a Stamina Nightblade or a Magicka Necromancer was difficult but necessary for all those striving to get good at PvP. Experienced players picked up on this quicker, since they are deeply embedded into the search for the best setups and are more willing to give up something they like for something that works better and they might like anyway once some time passes. Less experienced or less active players needed more time to make these adjustments. To this day I get people asking for pure Stamina Decay or Stamina Templar builds. It is not intuitive to slot Vigor on a Maeshsork, because it is deeply ingrained as a stamina physical ability. But with hybridization, your Magicka and Magical Harm will boost this skill, provided that those are the highest stats. By now, a year later, everyone knows about the same hybrid builds and sets, and what you find yourself fighting against is often the same over and over. YouTube and website content creators all upload similar builds, and players in general are very familiar playing with and against the same sets. The sets themselves are mostly proc sets, so you could yet again call the proc meta. That's pretty ironic considering the past efforts ZeniMax made to avoid this. For some reason though, sets like Master Dual Wield, Dragon's Appetite and Drogokin still have no scaling. It's not like this is impossible to implement either, considering the recent alteration of the Maelstrom two-handed weapons. But this whole debacle is actually a side note to the message here, which is that build diversity is at its lowest point I can remember in the history of this game. Hybridization and homogenization are, in my opinion and from a PvP perspective, a mistake. When you have 7 classes but the best way to PvP on them is not even class dependent, there is a problem. When it doesn't matter if you want to play a more Magicka or Stamina themed build because you end up with the same hybrid soup, there is a problem. When a recap of your damage done or received looks like this, and you can't even tell what class it was, there is a problem. This situation is also present in PvE, where the same weapon, race, skill and set choice is advisable across DPS builds. There too it leads to some frustration of those wanting to push for endgame meta builds, but being forced in the same hybrid setup over and over, no matter if you run Magicka or Stamina. The difference is though that in PvE the competitive scene is different. For starters, you can complete most of the content easily with a suboptimal build. You're not forced to run dual wield on every build or pick a hybrid skill choice as much as in PvP. To people having an issue with hybridization in PvE, the answer is simple. In 90% of PvE content you are not forced into running a meta setup. In fact, if you are a decent player, you can complete most dungeons and trials in a build of whatever flavor you like. Provided that you have some decent sets and skills, of which there is a pretty large choice, you can add a theme to it without facing major drawbacks. Only in harder trial hard modes this hybridization meta becomes an obligatory rule to follow again. The same counts for score pushing, since there you are entering a competition where every build detail counts. Score pushers, however, are only a very tiny fraction of the PvE player base. In PvP, by its very definition, everyone is in a competitive environment where every part of player skill and build matters to perform well. There's no minimum required amount of DPS, no entry level build that you can stick to if you want to become good and beat other good PvPers. The only PvP where you can truly mess around is in low MMR battlegrounds, so basically the first few battlegrounds you do on a new character. And obviously, if you have no interest in becoming decent at PvP, you can run whatever too. But normally players want to beat other players in PvP. Yeah, I know, crazy concept. And for that you need to have an upper edge, either in skill or in build. Skill brings you a long way, but if two good players fight each other, even if they are not exactly the same skill, build differences quickly take over the decision on who will win. This is especially the case with proc sets, where you can apply a strong amount of pressure over a long duration easily by hitting a couple of buttons. And thus, chasing the meta is what many players do to gain the upper edge. There's no fun in trying a new class or just playing your main as an average or decent player and getting clapped by someone at the same or lower skill level as you, simply because you are playing the wrong build. PvP is about having good fights and winning at least once in a while, and you're just not going to do that as a pure Stanblade versus someone with an optimized hybrid build. In the past, this situation boiled down to a few advised builds per spec per class, with a major difference between stamina and magicka builds and between classes as well. Hybridization and homogenization has erased much of this difference, making everything a bland mix between magicka and stamina and between classes. The choice of unique, separate specs and builds on which a player can stand a chance in this environment is severely limited now. And that has made theory crafting and the gameplay in general bland compared to what we had before. A line that I mentioned before and would like to repeat here again that summarizes the hybridization nicely is: one step forward, two steps back. We had the enjoyment of making a lot of new builds that embrace the hybrid meta. But now that this is done, we can see there are many more previous builds and gameplay archetypes that were lost in the process. To finish with, I want to touch on another reason that build diversity is at an all-time low, which is a noticeable lack of combat changes. Over the past year, not much changed to skills and sets. Some things were updated of course, but it's only a small amount of items that are looked at, and it happens at a snail's pace. Patch notes attaining to combat and gameplay are much less numerous than before. I am careful not to view this as a bad thing though, since the opposite, constant game-changing updates, is also bad. That's the situation we struggled with in the past, and a lot of pushback came against the combat changes back then for this amongst other reasons. Thus, reducing the amount of changes is a good idea. But the combination of a particularly stale meta with very low build diversity and nothing significantly changing makes combat and gameplay a lot less interesting. Thank you for watching.